All right. Welcome, everybody, to this next methods focused lecture. So, today we're going to talk about something that is going to make you immediately more dangerous as a researcher. Just kidding. We're talking about document and policy analysis methods. Okay. So, don't turn off the video yet. I know what some of you are thinking. Reading documents, that's just reading, right? Wrong. Wrong. What we're doing here is turning documents into systematic evidence, okay? So today you're going to learn how to interrogate texts in ways that are going to reveal patterns, power, institutional logic, and often contradictions between what institutions say they value and what they actually do, right? That's the critical environmental justice component here, okay? And you may find some similarities to when you did your ethnography and your power analysis. You might also find some similarities here to some of the qualitative coding and the power frameworks we talked about. But this is quite relevant to the assignment that you're going to do in terms of your policy analysis. And you can also apply some of these things to literature review as well. So I'm just trying to help you kind of think through how to dive into policy documents, with the best tools, the best approach possible, right? So I'm going to talk today about, when to know if document analysis is the right methodological choice versus when you might be better off doing interviews or surveying. Okay. Second, you're going to understand four distinct analytical approaches and critically which research questions each one actually helps you answer. Okay. Are these all of the approaches? Certainly not, but these are four that I'm introduced to you today. And third, you're going to be able to design a systematic workflow, okay, that's not going to make you want to quit your dissertation or your research proposal, your thesis halfway through. And fourth, I'm going to talk you through some of the common mistakes that a lot of researchers fall into and that you can avoid when you're doing this, right? So let's dive in, right? So why documents matter as data. And I mean, first of all, documents are everywhere, right? No matter what job you're going to be in, especially in this field, you're going to be exposed to a lot of records and documents. Okay. So it's best to get used to them and best to get familiar with them. Okay. So when we talk about documents and research, we're casting a really wide net, right? Official records like policies, regulations, and legislation. Organizational materials. This can include reports, internal memos, meeting minutes, public comms, such as media releases, campaign materials, educational campaigns, historical archives with, like correspondence, diaries, historical newspapers. The crucial point, really, though, is that documents exist independent of the researcher, right? So when you interview someone, you're co-creating that data, as we talked about, right? The participant is responding to you, to your questions, to how you are presenting yourself. Documents are different. The policy brief was written before you even showed up, right? It reveals what someone thought was important enough to write down, often for a specific audience with a specific purpose. Okay. This gives documents a different evidentiary status. They're traces of institutional processes, power dynamics, and decision making that happened whether or not you were there to observe it. It's also critical to see as a powerful method when you can't be there in person to conduct the interview or the survey, right? Resources are often scarce, as we talked about, time, and documents are often able to be accessed remotely and analyzed from anywhere you're at. Okay, so this makes for great undergraduate research, master's theses, things that you may not have the grant funds, the time, resources to actually be able to be on the ground to do. Okay, research does not only have to take place in the field. So when should you actually use this, right? So not every research question needs documents. And if you want to understand lived experiences, you need to interview people, right? But if you want to measure, like, let's say the prevalence of attitudes, you want to do a survey, right? But documents become your method when you're asking certain types of questions. How do institutions, organizations, entities frame problems? In that situation, you need documents, right? How has policy evolved over time? Documents are going to give you that longitudinal record, right? What arguments do powerful actors deploy to justify their decisions? That's in the documents, right? So, what's being systematically excluded or silenced in official narratives? Documents are going to reveal this. And if you're comparing policy across jurisdictions or organizations, comparable documents are key. So, here's a practical example. Say you want to understand why some countries banned single use plastics quickly while others dragged their feet. You don't need to analyze environmental policy documents, legislative debates, industry consultation submissions across multiple countries. The documents will show you the competing interests, right? The framing battles and the political compromise that shapes outcomes. Okay. So to get to the meat of this lecture, right, we have four core analytical approaches: content analysis, discourse analysis, frame analysis, and critical policy analysis. These aren't just different names for the same thing, they're distinct methodological approaches with different epistemological assumptions and analytical purposes. Okay. And they're not mutually exclusive. Strong researchers will often combine elements from multiple approaches. So let's start with content analysis. This is going to be systematic coding and quantification of document content. The operative word here is systematic. You're developing a structured approach to identify, code, and count specific features across the document set, right? This harkens back to our qualitative coding and when I talked about being really systematic in your approaches, right? So the strengths of this is it's replicable and it's very transparent. Another researcher following your codebook should arrive at similar results. It handles large document sets, right? So if you have 500 documents, content analysis is going to give you a tractable method, and it identifies patterns that aren't necessarily obvious from reading any single document, right? So you're going to define categories based on your research questions and theory, and then you're going to begin coding systematically, applying categories consistently. You're going to analyze the frequencies and relationships. And again, this isn't just counting words, you're measuring how often these particular themes, arguments, foci, right, or actors appear across the corpus of the information. Now, an example could be like imagine analyzing like a national park amendment, okay, and you're looking at these amendments on a temporal scale from 1992 to 2019, and you're coding 156 policy documents for mentions of local communities and their rights. Okay, so in 1992 only 3% of policy text addressed community rights, but by 2019, that jumped to 24%, right? So this quantitative shift can tell you something meaningful about policy evolution, right? This could say that conservation policy is increasingly acknowledging community concerns, but notice what this doesn't tell you, right? Whether that acknowledgement translates to actual rights, whether it's meaningful or just symbolic. What political struggles produce this shift? For those questions, you need other methods or other analytical approaches. So this can be quite complementary. The second approach is discourse analysis. You should be pretty familiar with this. We've used this a few times throughout the course. So this examines how language constructs meaning and power relations. And in this one, we're less concerned with counting and more interested in interrogating how particular ways of talking about issues are shaping what becomes thinkable or doable in policy. So some key questions for this approach could be what terms are used and what terms are carefully avoided, right? What assumptions are embedded in the language that speakers might not even recognize? And who gets positioned as having authority to speak on this issue? What subject positions are created? And by subject positions, I mean, what roles do people get assigned, right? Are they victims needing rescue, or are they experts with technical knowledge? Stakeholders to be consulted, right? These differences have key power dynamics and key environmental justice implications, right? These carry implications that could really translate powerfully to your research. And an example could be, okay, let's compare wildlife conflict policy in two countries. And in country one, documents refer to human wildlife conflict as a symmetrical framing, right? Both humans and wildlife have legitimate interests that sometimes clash. In country two, you see problem animal management, right? Animals are problems requiring management. This isn't, trivial semantics. Language may be shaping the policy response, right? If you have a conflict between legitimate interests, solutions might emphasize coexistence, compensation, land use planning. If you have a problem animal, solutions focus on removal, culling, relocation, right? This discourse makes certain interventions logical and others unthinkable. Notice who's getting to define the terms, right? It's not just the impacted communities, right? It's the state wildlife agencies. Another great example of how you could deploy this, right? Third approach is frame analysis. You have some practice with this, right? This identifies how issues are defined, how causes are attributed, and what solutions get proposed, right? Robert Entman's 1993 framework gives us 4 elements to trace, right? Problem definition, what's identified as wrong. I realized I should have been clicking through these. Here's content analysis, an example. Here's discourse analysis, an example. Here's frame analysis. So frame analysis can ask, what's identified as wrong? We can look for causal interpretation, right? What caused this problem? We can, look into moral evaluation, what values apply, and then look at treatment recommendation, right? What should be done or what has been done or what is, purported to be a solution. Frames, it can be powerful because they determine what's relevant and what's irrelevant to a policy problem, right? They tell us who's responsible and who benefits from solutions. And different stakeholders fight to establish their preferred frame as a dominant understanding, right? So it really shows like how different folks could be framing an issue. So like climate change and national adaptation plans is a good example. In this example, you could identify, let's say, at least three major frames globally. The security frame constructs climate change as threat to national stability. This has some military undertones. The economic frame emphasizes market risks, but also green growth opportunities. And then you have a justice frame, for instance, maybe that foregrounds disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations and invokes historical responsibility. Again, same phenomenon, but very different policy implications. Security frame leads to climate related defense budgets and border securitization, right? Economic frames might focus on carbon markets and green technology. Justice frames might demand climate reparations and adaptation financing for especially vulnerable areas, right? So when you analyze which frame dominates in a particular, let's say, country's policy, you can really predict what kinds of interventions will become politically viable. And the fourth approach is critical policy analysis. This interrogates power, equity, and whose interests policy serves, right? So it's explicitly normative. Okay. There we go. We're not pretending neutrality, right? We're asking who benefits from current policy arrangements, right? What voices are excluded from policy processes? How does policy reproduce or challenge existing inequality, right? What alternatives are rendered invisible or impossible, right? So this draws from critical theory traditions. I've been teaching you this all semester. You did this in your power analysis activity, right? You assumed that the policy is not neutral or technical problem solving in isolation, right? Policy reflects and reinforces these power relations. Critical policy analysis makes those power relations visible, right? You're bringing this to the surface. In that assignment, those folks who did really well, they really looked at what was missing, right? What was not here, and that's critical. So to create a workflow that's quite clear cut, this is just an example. You can, think of this in 4 phases. Okay, this will keep your analysis rigorous but also manageable. So phase 1, select your documents, right? Define clear inclusion and exclusion criteria. What counts as relevant? What am I going to look at? What am I going to exclude, right? Be systematic, be explicit. This is quite similar to like a technical what is the term I'm thinking of? I've totally lost my brain, but I did this for my master's. But I'll think of it. It'll come back to me. But define clear inclusion exclusion criteria, right? This is an important part of the method, right? What counts as relevant? Be very explicit. Consider your temporal scope. Are you analyzing 1 year, 1 decade, multiple decades, right? Assess accessibility and authenticity. Can you actually obtain these documents, right? And once you have them, how do you verify they're authentic and not altered, right? This is really critical to verify the quality of the documents you have and include that you're documenting those choices, those pathways you're proceeding, but also justifying everything that you're doing so you can show your evidence trail, your receipts. Phase 2 is going to be your initial reading, right? Before coding anything, read your corpus, read the body of literature holistically, right? You're getting a sense of major themes and patterns. You're going to note preliminary observations, keeping research memos, as we talked about, reflexivity. This will often reveal that your initial research questions maybe were slightly off, right? That's fine. You can refine them. It's better to adjust now than to code everything and go back and realize you're asking the wrong questions. So yes, read the documents as an initial step. Phase 3 is your coding and analysis, right? So you're going to develop a code book. This can be deductive, meaning you're defining the codes, remember, in advance based on a theory or framework, or inductive, right? You're looking as the codes emerge from the data. And you can combine both, right? That's fine, right? But you're going to start with some theoretical codes and then add emergent codes as you read. That's this sort of combination method. Systematic review is what I was trying to come up with earlier. Code systematically with transparency. I can't stress this enough, right? If you're working with a team, you need to establish intercoder reliability. You need to know that different coders are applying codes consistently. Track your analytical decisions in memos, right? When you made interpretive choices, document them. Reviewers are going to ask, right? You want answers. And then in phase 4, you're going to interpret it, right? This is where description becomes explanation, right? Contextualize these findings. What was happening politically when these documents were produced? What was silenced? What was missing, right? What was not said is analytically meaningful. Connect this to theory. What do your findings tell us about policy processes, about power, about institutional change? Go back to the week 2 lectures where I talked about this, right? Remember how I talked to, or how I described coding and how to connect this to theory and connect this to your findings. Again, you can use you know, in vivo, max QDA, deduce, or you can use spreadsheets, right? You don't have to have fancy technology to do this, right? But think about the tools you need to use. This might depend on your project scale, your analytical approach. You don't need expensive software. If you have 3,000 documents, you might want to try to invest in a more expensive software. Now, here are the pitfalls, right? I'm going to make you a better analyst by showing you where folks of all walks of life commonly fail, right? So 5 pitfalls. First, treating documents as neutral truth, right? Documents aren't transparent windows onto reality. They're constructed by actors with interests working under constraints, right? A government poverty report isn't the same as poverty itself, right? We have to think about this and talk about, what we just learned in the previous lecture about, how assessments are being undertaken. Second, you ignore context, right? Who wrote the document and for whom, under what conditions? A policy brief produced by an authoritarian regime has different status than one produced through open democratic debate, right? So think about who wrote this, who was the audience. This is when we're thinking about the quality of our data. Don't cherry pick evidence. It's tempting, right? But if you only analyze documents supporting your argument, you're doing advocacy, pure and simple, right? That's not research. Systematic selection criteria and being systematic in your review of these documents, this can help prevent this, right? This can help make it scientific and avoid that confirmation bias. Fourth, overcoding. Sometimes you create 70 codes that overlap and aren't actually analytically useful, right? So go through your codes in iterative process. Stay focused on your research questions. Determine when you can fold codes into broader parent codes or subcodes, right? But not everything needs a code. I know I talked about, okay, it's okay to overcode in some instances, but you have to start to refine over time. And overcoding in document analysis is a bad idea. Again, don't ignore silences. If a housing policy document never mentions race in a context where housing has been explicitly racialized, that's very important. Analyze it, note it, right? This was, again, so great to see in that video activity where students mentioned who was not speaking in the video or whose, perspectives were not present. This is critical to environmental justice research. This is critical to recognitional procedural justice. And what's a good doc, right? You need to assess that document quality. Ask these questions, right? Is this document authentic? What was its original purpose? Is it public communication? Is it an internal memo? Is it a legal requirement? Who was the intended audience? So critical, right? That really shapes the content. What constraints shaped the production, if you know it? Was the author writing freely or under, specific deadline pressures or political pressures or organizational mandates, right? What other documents are part of this conversations, right? Documents are rarely standalone, right? They're in dialogue. A policy brief could respond to an earlier report, right? It could anticipate criticism, look for that criticism. It could position itself against alternatives, look for those alternatives. Triangulate whenever possible. I always talk about this in this course, but triangulate, right? Get as many sources and compare and contrast and connect and look for those networks and relationships, right? If you're analyzing climate policy, look for media coverage, interview policymakers, right? Review NGO reports, look at community interviews, look at documentaries, look at how communities are organizing and what their groups are saying, right? Multiple data sources are always going to strengthen your claims, okay? Ethics matter in document analysis too, right? Even though you're not directly interacting with human subjects, right? So think about this. Are these documents truly public? And were they obtained ethically? Okay. Just because you can access something doesn't mean you should use it. Okay. Think about that. Leaked documents require careful ethical reflection. All right. Confidentiality. If documents contain identifying information, how are you going to protect these individuals? Redaction may be necessary. Are you reproducing harm? If you're analyzing colonial era documents or documents containing racist language, you need strategies for engaging critically without amplifying that harm or putting that harm back on a stage. Okay. Positionality again, right? What's your relationship to the documents and the communities they concern, right? If you're an outsider analyzing policy affecting communities, you're not part of it, right? That shapes what you can claim to know. Acknowledge it, be transparent about it, as we talked about in earlier lectures. So, again, let me bring this home with what you need to remember. Documents, they offer rich data on institutional processes, power relations, and meaning making at the policy level, right? They show you how organizations, companies, governments, how they think, right? How they justify decisions, and sometimes how they contradict themselves. Choose your analytical approach based on your research questions. So refine, make sure you are rooted in those research questions, make sure they are strong. Content analysis for patterns and frequencies, quantitative. Discourse analysis for language and power, qualitative. Frame analysis for how issues are constructed, comparative, could be causal. Critical policy analysis for EJ and critical analysis, right? Be systematic and transparent in your methods and how you made those decisions, okay? Document decisions so others can evaluate your processes, right? Keep a very transparent audit trail. So important in this process. And again, context always matters, right? Documents never speak for themselves. They really require interpretation in light of production conditions and circulations. You have the power to provide that interpretation, to shed that light. And combine approaches when appropriate, right? Many strong studies are going to use multiple analytical lenses to answer complex questions. If you're studying climate policy, you might use content analysis to track changing frequencies of adaptation versus mitigation language over time, discourse analysis to examine how climate gets constructed as security threat versus opportunity for sustainability. And you might use critical analysis to ask whose interests current framings serve. Okay. See how we bridged all those approaches. It's giving us a really rich study, a really rich data set. So here's your next step. You are going to do a safeguard analysis, a policy analysis of a safeguarding process, right? So you're going to apply these approaches, see what you learn, right? Start simple. Again, don't get overwhelmed, but there are a lot of documents, right? Document analysis is a skill. It's going to improve with practice. And the first time you code, it might be slow and uncertain. That's normal. And the more you work with the data, the more you see patterns. Okay. So you'll be able to ask sharper questions. Again, it gives you a particular power as a researcher to do this type of work, right? You can hold institutions accountable to their own stated commitments, right? You can look into how they're evaluating the impacts of harm on communities, right? And when a government says, for instance, let's give an example of, they prioritize indigenous rights, but if the policy documents never mention indigenous peoples, right, that's evidence for contradiction. When a corporation publishes sustainability reports, but internal documents reveal different priorities, right? That matters. You have the power, right? Documents can create this paper trail that reveal how power actually operates, not how it claims to operate. Okay. Again, you don't need perfect conditions to do good document analysis. You don't need an ideal archive, the perfect software, or complete access to all the documents. That's quite rare. Work with what you can get. Be transparent about your limitations and be systematic, right? You make the strongest claims that your evidence supports, but back it up, right? That's rigorous research. That's the best you can ask for. So, again, take what you learned here, apply it, read over this week's assignment, code systematically. Come to office hours if you have any questions. Again, this will serve you strongly in your future, professional academic works, right? But you have to flex this muscle. You have to build these skills. Okay. So now go analyze something. We'll speak soon.